Welcome back to another episode of Required Reading. This is going to be the final episode of the reading of the novelization of the movie Halloween from 1978. The novelization written by Curtis Richards and published in 1979. So this time we're going to be covering chapters 13, 14, and 15. Here we go. Chapter 13. On a dark cul-de-sac called Porter Lane, three diminutive figures dressed in dark clothes stealthily approached a large stone house. A big picture window commanding a sweeping lawn revealed a family watching television. A father and a mother, a young girl, a baby boy, and an older woman, presumably the grandmother. The three dark shapes blended with the shadows like jaguars stalking their prey. On signal from the one in the center, the other two fanned out, approaching the target window from the flanks while the leader bellied towards the middle. Now the three crouched directly underneath the window, and the leader indicated it was time. They donned their fright masks and rose up as one with their soap bars. "Yah!" they roared, slamming their open palms on the window while scrawling with the soap bars with their free hands. The children went shrieking out of the den. The older woman put her hand to her heart and screamed silently. The mother gazed stupidly, while the father, who was the only one to grasp what was happening, stared in a combination of anger and amusement. He had probably done the same when he was a kid. Howling with laughter, Keith, Richie, and Lonnie fled into the night, cutting across the frozen bed of the stream on the Samuels property and slowing to a panting walk on Willow Circle. "Did you see the look on the old lady's face?" Keith said. "Yeah, I just hope she didn't have a heart attack," said Lonnie. "Now what?" Richie asked. "The Myers house, right?" "Right. Look at Richie," Keith said to Lonnie. "He looks like we just asked him to drop his pants in Taft Square." "Bullshit," the smallest of the three said. "Then let's go, and you'll go in first." "Fine," Richie said, biting his lip. They cut across the Henderson backyard and found themselves on the sidewalk 2 houses down from the Myers house. It stood squat and dark and malevolent among its neighbors like some deformed creature. The gusty wind beat the branches of a huge, untrimmed tree against the upper story. "Okay, wise ass, lead the way," said Lonnie. Richie stuck his chin out. "Sure, watch." He strode arrogantly up to the front door, then faltered. He turned to his friends and gestured for them to follow. Lonnie and Keith stepped forward a few paces, bracing to run. "What are you afraid of?" Lonnie yelled. "I'm not afraid." "Bullshit, you're afraid of the boogeyman. You weren't afraid of him when you pushed Tommy Doyle around at school today." "You pushed him too, you know, and I don't see you going into this house." "We'll go in when you go in." "All right. Then stand right here behind me." The 2 stragglers looked up. Faint silver shadows flashed over the structure as clouds scudded before the moon. The wind gusted, quickening the tattoo of the branches on the clapboard upstairs. All at once, the bushes at the side of the house rattled and a human figure burst out. "Get your asses away from here," it bellowed, waving its hands. "Whoa! Yikes! Jesus!" Moving like the wind, the 3 tumbled off the porch and hurtled down the street, not stopping until they were safely locked behind the doors of their homes. Sam Loomis grinned. It was a dirty trick, but he had to get them out of there, both for their sakes and for his own. Now he went back to his blind watching and waiting, shivering in the cold night air. He did not see the hand reach out for his shoulder, but at the first contact he whirled around in a fluid motion, the big gun materializing in his fist like a conjurer's hair. "Hey, it's me, don't shoot," Sheriff Brackett cried. "Good God, Brackett, don't sneak up on me like that." "Sorry, Loomis. It's second nature to me. Put the bazooka away." "Yes, of course. I'm rather jumpy, as you can see." "But you're all right." "Sure. Has anything happened?" Brackett shook his head. "Nothing going on. Just the usual. Kids playing pranks, trick-or-treating, pocking and necking, getting high. I have a feeling you're way off on this one." "You have the wrong feeling," Loomis said firmly. "You're not coming up with much to prove me wrong, aside from one half-eaten dog." "Exactly. What more do you need?" "I don't know, but it's going to take a lot more than some sophisticated psychological interpretation to keep me up all night creeping around these bushes." Loomis looked at him with a directness that made Beckett extremely uncomfortable. "I watched him for 15 years, sitting in a room staring through the walls. If you can understand that, staring through the walls and seeing this night. He's waited for it, planned for it, focused his life on it. He's inhumanly patient, hour after hour, day after day, waiting for some silent, invisible alarm to trigger him, a voice to tell him the time has come, a gauge to tell him his blood has begun to boil. Death has arrived in your little town, Sheriff. You can ignore it, or you can help me stop it." Brackett shook his head skeptically. "More fancy talk. You want to know what Haddonfield is? Families, children, nice homes all lined up in white rows and down the streets. Oak trees, picket fences, an old school with a new annex. Lot of churches, all denominations. 5 and dime, hardware store, beauty parlor, coffee shop, some bars, and a gas station. I'm describing a small Midwestern town to you, Loomis, not a slaughterhouse." "You could be describing both." "I'll stay out with you tonight, Doctor, just on the chance that you're right. And if you are right, then damn you for letting him out." Loomis dropped his head. There was nothing he could say in reply. His name was Bob Sims, and the girls all thought he was gorgeous. He was tall and lanky, a pitcher for the baseball team, a tight end for the football team, possible valedictorian of the class, and at least one of its top 3 or 4 scholars. He could have any college he wanted, and any girl. The girl he wanted on this particular night was Lauren and Annie's leggy friend Linda. Bob picked her up in his father's van, which had been customized as a recreational vehicle with a bunk bed in the back. Bob and Linda had made love back there many times, and though the car's heater worked, they preferred to make love in a house now that the cold weather had set in. So when Annie had gotten her babysitting gig with Lindsay Wallace, the 2 girls had worked out a plan. As soon as Lindsay went to sleep, Annie's Paul would come over and they'd make out upstairs in the Wallace's bedroom, and Bob and Linda would go to it downstairs on the convertible sofa. Good plan. "You ready for a little trick-or-treat?" Bob asked her when he picked her up, yanking the tab off the can of a Budweiser with a loud pop and a rush of foam. "Sure," Linda laughed. They laughed, embraced, and guzzled, then drove over to the Wallace's house. As they pulled up in the front of the Wallace's home, Linda reviewed the plan. "Now, are you sure you've got it?" "Sure. First I rip your clothes off." He leaned across the passenger seat and buried his lips in Linda's soft neck while running a hand under her sweater. She laughed and spilled beer over his head. "You idiot!" "Then you rip my clothes off." "I think I've got it." "You've got something," she said, sliding her hand up his muscular thigh. "Now I've got something." "Geez, Linda," Bob gasped with a rush of desire. "Let's pray for a sleeping Lindsay." "Yes, but in case our prayers aren't answered, maybe we could drop some Valium in her chocolate milk." "You're terrible." "Totally," Linda said, pushing open the door. Bob opened the door, got out, and helped Linda step down on the other side. They walked up the path to the big old house, and when they reached the front door, Bob scooped Linda effortlessly into his arms and carried her the rest of the way. "Bob, put me down! Put me down! This is totally silly!" Linda protested through her feeble kicks belied her protests. She reached out and turned the knob of the front door. The door swung open and the couple paused on the threshold. "Annie?" The house was dark and still. Annie, we're here. No answer. They let their eyes adjust to the darkness, then stepped into the house. They cocked their ears and thought they heard a creak upstairs. They called Annie's name again. Again, no answer. I wonder if they're here at all, Bob said. Maybe they're upstairs already. Lindsay's asleep and Annie and Paul are up there already, Linda speculated. Bob turned on a light. I don't know. I don't want to be surprised in the middle of, well, in the middle. Let's look for a note. Let's don't, Linda said, turning the light off and sliding into his arms. He pressed his mouth to hers and her lips parted. Her tongue entwined his as her body melted against his powerful torso. He slid his hands over her back and clasped her buttocks, practically lifting her off the floor. Now, she murmured, shall we continue Plan A? I guess, he said, leading her to the couch. I just wish I could be sure about Annie and Paul. He went to the foot of the stairs and observed a light on under the door of the master bedroom. A faint creak came from there. He stood indecisively looking up. Linda came up behind him and put her arms around him. Bob, the only thing you have to worry about is getting up for the occasion. It's never been a problem before, and it shouldn't be now. He took her by the hand, and they laid down on the couch. Linda's body arched up at once as if the seat of the couch was molten metal. She urged her breasts and pelvis at her lover, and he took them avidly, pushing her sweater up to her neck and covering her breasts and belly with kisses. Her nipples contracted into hard nuggets under the flicking of his warm tongue, and his hand caressed her belly lovingly, his fingers gliding beneath the tops of her jeans and under the silky smoothness of her bikini panties. His fingers undid the top snap of the jeans and artfully slid the zipper down, his hand coming to the rest on the silky crotch of her panties. She moaned and strained her body upwards to receive his caresses. In the shadow of the kitchen door he watched them. His breathing was heavy, but the noise of their excitement subdued the sound of his own. After that incredible moment of thrill as he plunged the blade into the dark-haired girl's abdomen and slit her stomach open to the ribs, he had come down to a state of euphoric calm. For a while he had thought that the lust was permanently discharged, and the voice quieted. That was how it had been with Judy. But then he had been 6 years old. Now it was different. The sight of the couple on the couch had brought new stirring in his body, and the voice was whispering to him once more. He knew this night was not over. The phone rang, and he shrank back into the cover of darkness. Bob and Linda sat up sharply, letting the phone ring 3 times in the hope that Annie would take it upstairs. The Wallaces would think it odd that someone other than their babysitter was picking up the phone. But when no one picked it up, Linda reached for the downstairs phone on the table beside the couch. Hello? Linda said dreamily. Linda? Is that you? Laurie! Hi! Hi. What's happening? Wouldn't you like to know? Linda giggled. Hey, do you know where Annie is? Yes, she's... Tommy, cut it out. Linda, just a second. In the background, Linda heard a ghostly sound and screaming, then Laurie shouting, seeming to berate somebody. At length, she got back on the phone. Sorry, Tommy was chasing Lindsay around with a pumpkin on his head. Lindsay's there? Linda blurted. Uh-huh. See, Annie decided to go over to Paul's, so she left Lindsay here with me. Ah, so that means we have the house to ourselves. Looks that way. But listen, would you please be sure to have Annie call me the second she gets back? I've got to get Lindsay back over there before her parents come home. Fine. Have a good time, Laurie said. We're planning to. Linda hung up and grabbed Bob by the hand. Well, old boy, it looks as if we've got the house all to ourselves, including the bed upstairs. Bob laughed. Well, now, to use your phrase, that sounds totally fantastic. Shall we go? He offered his hand, and she grasped it. Thank you, kind sir. He led the way up the stairs, hesitating before the door to the master bedroom because the door was closed, and a light streamed under it and into the hallway, a flickering orange light. Then he shrugged and opened the door. They laughed. On the night table, a jack-o'-lantern flickered. "Well, Mr. Jack-o'-lantern, you're going to see some things tonight," Linda said, patting it on its pole. "How about this for starters?" Facing the pumpkin's grotesque grin, she did a sensuous striptease, wriggling out of her sweater and jiggling her breasts, cupping them with her bare hands in mute offering to the pumpkin, then bumping and grinding out of her jeans until she was prancing before the jack-o'-lantern in bikini panties. Bob laughed, reaching out and grabbing her wrist. "I'm jealous." "Of a pumpkin?" "Well, if you're into squashes so much, try this zucchini," he said, putting her hand on the rock-like bulge under his jeans. I have a sudden hunger for zucchini," she whispered, helping him unbuckle his belt and unbutton his jeans. His knees began to weaken, and he leaned on her shoulders for support. Then, when he could stand it no longer, he pulled her to her feet and towards the bed. Bob grinned and sat astride her, kneading her breasts until the nipples were like stones. Her hips writhed under him, her pelvis thrusting involuntarily in circular motions. He needed no coaxing. Kneeling between her quivering thighs, he slid into her up to the hilt, and her moan of pleasure filled the room with its primitive timbre. He wrapped his arms tightly around her slim, firm waist, and she covered his broad back with sharp-nailed fingers. He pumped rhythmically into her, her hips stropping him to an awesome height of need and pleasure. "Oh, Bob, I think it's happening," she whimpered. "Me too." And that's when the phone rang. Bob stopped at mid-stroke, gripped with uncertainty. "Shit, not again." "Forget about it," Linda said. "We have more important things to do." The phone sounded again. "What if it's Annie?" "She'll call us again." "And what if it's the Wallaces?" "If it's the Wallaces and we answer, we'll get Annie into trouble." "Yeah, but what if—" "What if it's your mommy?" Linda taunted. Bob laughed. "I'll just tell her I'm really into something right now that I can't get out of." There, it stopped. I'll take it off the hook. He reached across her body to the night table where the jack-o'-lantern guarded the telephone, and took the phone off its cradle. Then he turned his attention back to her. "Now, where were we?" "Old Mr. Zucchini getting soft enough to mash," she said, stroking him with artful grinds of the pelvis. "There, that's better." "Oh, yeah, that's better. That's much better." He stood in the hall watching them resume their coupling, and the desire returned. His fingers caressed the handle of his knife in rhythm to the powerful strokes of the man's buttocks against the widespread girl's body. The voice spoke loudly to him, urging him to act, but he held himself back, anxious to see the climax of their performance. He was soon rewarded. "Oh, Bob, I think it's going to happen now. Now! "Yes, yes!" Bob cried, nailing her to the bed with his lanky, powerful body. Their voices mingled with moans and pants and endearments as they thrashed at the last lust out of one another's flesh. Then they lay still for a minute or two, the boy's back a tempting target for the blade of the man who stood outside their door, breathing deeply but silently. No, not yet. At length, Bob rolled off Linda and groped around the floor for his shirt. He found it and produced a pack of cigarettes and lit two, giving her one. They lay on their backs, blowing thin streams of smoke into the air. "Fantastic," Linda sighed. "Totally fantastic." "Yeah." "Want a beer?" "Yeah." "Is that all you have to say?" "Yeah." "Go get me a beer." "I thought you were going to get me one," Bob said. "Yeah?" "Oh, well." Reluctantly, Bob climbed out of the bed and stepped into his jeans. Then he groped around the floor for his glasses and found them at last, donning them. Linda looked at him. Do you really need those? I only wear them when I'm looking for beer, he replied with a grin. I'll be right back. He leaned over the bed and kissed her. Don't get dressed. Silently, the visitor withdrew from his observation place outside the door and drifted soundlessly down the stairs, taking his place in the large utility closet in the kitchen. He waited and listened, knife poised. In due time, through the slightly open door, he saw the boy come into the kitchen. He had on jeans but no shirt or shoes and socks, and he wore horn-rimmed glasses. The boy's body was sleek, hairless, and muscular. Bob went directly to the refrigerator in the dark and opened the door, sending a stream of light across the kitchen floor. He took 2 beers out, closed the door, and opened a cupboard. Peanuts, peanuts, peanuts. Ah, here they are. And potato chips are here. He gathered the food in his arms and turned to leave, but didn't see the legs of a stool half under a counter, and he tripped, dropping everything. Muttering, he stooped and picked it up. Then he heard the creak of a door behind him. Arms loaded, he freed a hand and opened the kitchen door. Annie? Paul? He called. No jokes, huh? I'm in the midst of something very important. No answer. He closed the door and locked it. Then he heard the creak again and realized it was coming from the utility closet. He put the beer and food down on the counter and stealthily approached the door. Then he flung it open. Okay, Linda, come on out. Come on, I know it's... The thing lunged out like a leaping tiger, its left hand gripping Bob's neck in a death clutch. Bob fell back, grabbing at his throat, then swung at the head of his tormentor. The man took the blow full on the face, but it didn't faze him. He slammed Bob up against the wooden pantry door and lifted him clear off the tile floor by the throat. Gurgling noises came from his windpipe as he clawed at the rubber mask on his assailant's face. If Bob was going to escape, he'd have to make his best shot now, because the oxygen supply was rapidly dwindling, and he knew he had but a few seconds. He cupped his hands over his head and brought them down with full force on the man's head. It shook him, but failed to weaken his grip on Bob's throat. Out of the corner of his eye, Bob saw the blade in the man's free hand, and he brought his knees up in a helpless gesture of self-protection. He actually heard the whap of the knife as the killer drove it into his gut with stupendous force. Then the blackness came over him. Linda dragged impatiently on her cigarette, then ground it out in the ashtray on the night table, just under the grimacing mouth of the jack-o'-lantern. Well, Jack, where is he? I sent him down 10 minutes ago for 1 lousy beer. Is he manufacturing it or what? If he were half the man he looks like, he'd have made the round trip in record time and would be back in bed by now. Isn't that right, Jack? The pumpkin's flame answered her with mute flickering. Linda tapped another cigarette out of the pack and hung it on her lower lip. Then she grinned with inspiration. Hey, baby, light my fire, she said to the jack-o'-lantern, thrusting the cigarette through the pumpkin's nose and lighting it on its candle. Thanks. You may look like a punk, but deep down inside you're a real gentleman. Not like some people. She heard the steps creaking and composed herself under the covers. The steps were heavy, like an old man's or someone laboring under a big load. Thank God, Linda sighed. Where's my beer? The door opened, and she laughed, shaking her head. He wore a sheet over his head with the eyes cut out, and over his eyes he wore Bob's heavy glasses. He stood inside the door, staring at her, breathing in long, sighing wheezes that blew the sheet away from his mouth with each exhalation. Cute, Bob, real cute. Come here, you fool. He came no closer. I'll bet I can get your ghost, she said, sliding the sheet teasingly off her chest. Linda laughed at her own joke, but when the ghost remained planted in the doorway, she frowned and brusquely pulled the sheets back up around her throat. All right, so where's the beer? No response. Well, answer me. Okay, don't answer me. Boy, you are weird. Still no response. The ghost stood fixed to a spot like a tree. Bob, enough's enough. You're making me nervous. No response. Oh, shit. Okay, for you. She got out of the bed, completely nude. She walked to the pile of clothes at the foot of the bed. In the soft glow of the candle, she looked incredibly beautiful. She did not walk so much as glide. She knew what effect she had on men, and if this didn't do the trick, Bob must be made out of brick. She pulled her panties out of the pile and dangled them in front of the ghost's glasses, stroking them with her other hand. Last chance, pal, before I hide the jewels. She paused, waiting for a reply. Then she shrugged. Okay. She stepped into her panties and turned away. Well, I'm going to call Laurie. I want to know where Annie and Paul are. This isn't going anywhere. She picked up the phone and pivoted, turning her back on the ghost. She dialed the Doyles. The ghost began to advance. Linda could see him coming out of the corner of her eye. While she waited for Laurie to pick up the phone, she said, Well, I finally got you to make your move. I knew it. As soon as I hide my ass, you want to pull my pants down. You men are all He clamped one hand over her mouth and with the other wrapped the phone cord around her throat. She reacted with the ferocity of a victim in full panic, clawing at his knuckles with sharp nails and tearing strips of his flesh off the back of his hand. He gripped her more tightly despite the searing pain. On the other end of the phone line, he could hear someone saying, Hello? Hello? He gripped the wire tighter. The girl danced madly in his clutches, biting, kicking, wriggling, scratching, pounding, pulling, striking. She fought harder than any of them, fought with amazing pluck, but it was all for naught. All for naught. Her movements began to slow down and become more jerky and frenetic. Her face was turning blue and her tongue flopped around her lips as if it had no organic connection with the rest of her body. Her eyes bulged like a frog's, the red blood vessels in the whites bursting with the overload. With one last frantic effort, she aimed 10 fingernails at his eyes, but he buried his face in the back of her neck so that she had no good target. Her nails tangled in the bedsheet. When her hands went limp at last, they dragged the sheet with them, revealing her assassin. He wore a grotesque mask. Hello? Hello? Laurie tapped her fingernails impatiently on the phone. All right, Annie, I've heard your famous chewing. Now I get your famous squeals? The gurgles and sputters continued. Annie? Annie, are you all right? Now she heard a heavy, throaty breathing. Annie, are you fooling around again? Annie, I'll kill you if this is a joke. Oh, God, I can't wait for this day to end, she said, slamming the phone down. She went to the window and looked across the street. Bob's van was still parked there, but except for an orange glow from the upstairs window, all the lights in the Wallace house were out. Laurie decided to phone there one more time. If nobody answered, she'd have to run across the street. She dialed the Wallace number and waited. The phone rang 4, 5, 6, 7 times. With each ring, Laurie prayed harder that the joke would be over, that Linda or Bob or Annie or Paul would pick it up with an inimitable laughter, tell her it was all a big put-on. 8 rings, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Chapter 14. Laurie put the phone down heavily and stood beside it, pondering her options. It was not so much that she didn't know what she must do. It was that she didn't want to do it. She tiptoed upstairs. Tommy and Lindsay were sprawled on Tommy's bed like a couple of rag dolls dropped from 10 feet, hands and feet dangling over the sides, and an assortment of dolls, game pieces, cars, trucks, fire engines, and erector set components covered the bed and floor as if all had been packed into the muzzle of a mortar and fired indiscriminately into the room. Tommy was in his pajamas, but Lindsay, who had not been expected to stay so late, was still in her clothes. Laurie felt safe in leaving them. She knew from countless babysitting assignments with them that their deepest slumber was immediately after falling asleep. They would not wake up, and not finding her in the house pushed the panic button. She went back downstairs and opened her purse. She had a ring with 4 or 5 keys belonging to the people she regularly sat for, and she selected the one to the Wallace house. She opened the front door of the Doyle house, stepped outside, and looking ruefully across the street, closed it behind her. She crossed the street and stood before the Wallace house, studying its hulking vastness for a sign of life. Except for the mellow flicker of a candle upstairs, there was none. She glanced in Bob's van, but nobody was in it either. Her feet felt as if they had been fitted with leaden shoes as she walked the last few yards and mounted the steps to the veranda encircling the house. She tested the knob of the front door. There was no need for her key. The door swung open. She peered inside, listening. She heard a floorboard groan, but perhaps not. She stepped inside and stood in the arched entrance to the living room. Annie? Bob? Linda? The total silence that greeted her sent a shudder down her spine. She reached for the wall switch and flipped it. The room remained dark. Cursing, she retreated to the entry hall and tried the switch to the big chandelier there. No response. "You guys have really been blowing some fuses," she said with a nervous laugh. She stayed in the hall a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. Then she ventured into the living room. It was devoid of life, but an examination of the rumpled pillows on the couch indicated that some heavy petting had gone on. They were probably upstairs. All of them? She wondered. "Oh, Lord, just what I need, walking in on an orgy," she said aloud. She jumped when she heard something heavy like furniture being moved upstairs, followed by a crash. She rushed to the foot of the stairs and stared up. The bedroom door was closed, but an eerie orange light radiated from under it. She managed to smile, shaking her head. "All right, meatheads, the joke is over." She took one tentative step up the stairs and paused to listen. "Come on, Annie, enough." A new sound greeted her, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. The sound stopped abruptly, followed by a closet door shutting in the upstairs bedroom. Laurie took 3 more steps. "This has definitely stopped being funny, guys. Now cut it out." Now a scraping sound. Her heart began to thunder and she thought of fleeing, but she knew what kind of laughingstock she'd be at school if she did, when Annie and Paul and Linda told everybody about how they scared Laurie Strode out of her shoes on Halloween. "You'll be sorry," she shouted as she made her way up the stairs with determination. Sam Loomis was cold, and getting colder. Had he known he'd be staked out in a hedge in the middle of a cold October night, he'd have dressed for the occasion, but he had worn his trench coat over a summer business suit, and he was cold. Aside from the 3 kids he'd chased off, there'd been no activity at the Myers house, and as the evening wore into night, Loomis began to wonder why he had expected that there would be. Yes, the fellow had returned to the scene of the crime in the best tradition of criminals, but that was much earlier. To what end would he hang around the house? Wouldn't he seek elsewhere for victims? Because he was cold, and because he'd begun to realize he was barking up the wrong tree, Loomis started to pace. He paced up the block and down, glancing over his shoulder often so as not to take his attention totally off the Myers house. He paced in an ever-lengthening pattern, and the more he did, the more certain he became that his quarry was near. His conclusion was based on reason and emotion. Intellectually, he reasoned that with the strange affection of a hunter for his prey, his maniac had indeed come home today, and he'd seek victims in the immediate neighborhood. But it wasn't just intellectual deduction. It was a feeling, a hunch. Loomis's spine quivered like a divining rod near water. Evil was afoot, and it was nearby. If only he could get some definite sign. Loomis's pacing swept him farther and farther away from the Myers house, and soon he was turning his back on it with impunity, for he was now convinced his maniac was not there. Back and forth like a pendulum, Loomis swung, attuning himself to the vibrations of evil in the air, and trying to get a fix on them like a pilot seeking radio guidance on a stormy night. He debated with himself as to whether he should continue going straight up and down the block, or turn corners and form a kind of search grid with his pacing. At a certain corner, he felt strongly drawn and decided to let the force carry him even if he lost sight of the Myers house entirely. It was as if he were the planchette on a Ouija board and someone had asked him, "Is a murderer near at hand?" The force of the vibrations was sending him where? Down this oak-lined street and toward that car. Why that car? But it was not a car. It was a station wagon. A station wagon! Could it be the one? His pace quickened. It was hard to tell the color of the vehicle because of the yellow arc light of the street lamps overhead, but it seemed to be that livid purplish brown of the state's hospital's station wagon. One glance at the side of the vehicle would tell him. He strained his eyes, seeking the emblem on the door, his legs churning at a pace they hadn't done for a decade, and inside his head the vibrations of evil grew immeasurably stronger with each yard he covered. She stood on the landing, paralyzed with uncertainty. At the foot of the stairs she'd been certain this was a big put-on by her friends, but with each step she mounted her doubts had mounted too. If this were a practical joke, it was, well, too good, too professional. Where were the whispering and the giggling, the shushing and the tittering? There was too much silence. Entirely too much silence. She peered at the crack under the door. A mellow orange line that shimmered seductively like a neon sign advertising some forbidden delight. She clenched her teeth. If this was a setup, they were doing a terrific job. Special effects and everything. How could she not go in? She stepped forward 2 paces and encircled the doorknob with her hand. The muscles of her legs were tense like those of a runner at the start of a race, prepared to spring back and down the stairs at the first sign of trouble. She pushed the door open a crack. She could see a pair of feet on the bed, but whose she couldn't yet identify. Just out of the range of her vision, a candle or jack-o'-lantern cast an orange light on the legs. Laurie opened the door 2 inches farther and stuck her head into the bedroom. She took in more and more of the figure on the bed. The feet, the knees, the thighs, the pubic hair, the pelvis, the belly slit from waist to throat. The intestines spilled out on the bed linens. The gash across the throat splashed blood. The white, bloodless face of Annie. A silent scream on her mouth, the lucid horror of doom in her wide eyes. And behind her head, a tombstone. The tombstone said, "Our beloved daughter, Judith Margaret Myers." There were dates, but Laurie did not read them because things happened too fast from that moment on. She heard her own scream and realized in an instant that whatever it was that had slaughtered her best friend must be here, near, waiting for her. It was then that she caught sight of Bob, suspended by the throat from a rope tied from a ceiling fixture. His tongue, purple and bloated, dangled idiotically from his swollen lips, and bloody gore spilled from a fist-sized hole in his abdomen. Laurie's legs seemed to melt beneath her, and her will to flee flowed out of them as if released by a spigot. The time it took for her to run seemed like a week, but as she did pivot, a closet on her right opened, revealing Linda propped up in a chair, nude. From the neck down, unlike Annie and Bob, her body was unmarred, but her neck and face were livid with broken blood vessels, as if some stupendous force had squeezed all her blood up into her head until the pressure had burst every capillary in her skin. Her red eyes all but bulged out of her head on their stalks, and her tongue slavered over her lower lip like a mongoloid's. If Laurie was screaming now, the pounding fear in her brain made it impossible for her to hear it. For someone whose experience of horror had been limited up to that moment to the sight of small animals run over on the highway, the load on her circuits was so tantamount to sending 1,000,000 volts through a wire designed to carry 100. What prevented her from passing out at that instant She did not know. But a voice inside her brain demanded that she take measures to survive, and she concentrated on it despite every instinct to submit to blind panic. At the same moment that she came to this conclusion, she saw a shadow, dark and dreadful, looming up in the flicker of the jack-o'-lantern. She knew it was the man who'd been dogging her steps that day, and she knew that he expected her to drop backwards so that he could catch her off balance. So she did something illogical, and it saved her life. She ducked. She dropped to her haunches as he lunged for her. His hand swiped at her neck, and as he tripped over her shoulder, grabbing and tearing the arm of her blouse, but he got no more of her than that. But now she had a bigger problem, for he'd sprawled out on the landing, blocking her way down the stairs. He grunted and rose to his feet slowly, almost casually. He had her cornered, and it was just a matter of closing the gap. He reached into his belt and drew out a huge knife clotted with blood. Laurie backed away, wondering if she could lure her attacker away from the stairs, but as he advanced on her, he kept his body between her and the landing. Like a computer, her brain assessed the possibilities. She could retreat into the bedroom and try to bar the door. Too chancy. She could flee into another room. That was no safer. Or she could dive over the stairway railing and take her chances with the drop. That's what it had to be. She glanced over the rail and estimated it to be 8 or 10 feet to the first floor. She braced for the leap, just as he was bracing for his. She sprang, placing her hand on the rail as if it were a gymnastic horse, and boosted her legs over it. For a second she clutched the railing. His grip was tremendously strong, but he was in an awkward position. Trying desperately to hold her with his left hand, he swiped at her with the knife in his right, but it grazed her arm and he released her. She tried to make her feet land squarely on the steps below, but her right foot caught one step poorly and a sharp pain shot up through her ankle. Her right arm burned where the tip of the knife had caught her. As she clutched it, she felt the wetness of blood. But she was alive, and now she had to get out of here. She could see him, doubled over the railing, but he recovered quickly and made for the landing. Laurie climbed to her feet. The pain in her ankle was excruciating, but she managed to hobble towards the kitchen. She heard him stumping down the stairs. As she reached the security of the kitchen, she could see him turning the bend off the stairway, the steel of his knife blade glinting with reflected light from the street lamps. She flung the kitchen door shut and grabbed a steel chair from the dinette table. She propped it under the doorknob a scant second before she felt the thud of his shoulder against the door and heard his muffled grunt of frustration. She limped to the outside door and turned the knob. It was locked or jammed, probably intentionally, probably by the same hand that had knocked out the lights. She groped for the button that she knew unlocked some types of storm doors, but couldn't find it. All of a sudden, the other door exploded as his fist penetrated it, sending wooden shrapnel across the room. The door boards groaned and splayed inward as his arms sank through them to the shoulder. Laurie watched with round-eyed fascination before returning to her task of getting out. She shook the knob in desperation, but did little more than rattle the glass. Behind her, she could hear him widening the hole in the door with a second splintering punch. Well, she told herself, struggling to keep her wits, if he can smash this door, I can smash mine. She looked around for a blunt instrument or even a towel to cushion her hand from the glass shards, but finding none and hearing the chair propping up the other door sliding to the floor, she balled her fist and struck the pane nearest the door. It shattered, and she felt a dozen glass claws rupturing the flesh of her knuckles. But if there was pain, it was overridden by driving fear and desperation. She groped for a lock and found a little butterfly bolt under the knob. She twisted it and turned the inside knob with the other hand, shoving the frame with her shoulder. The door gave, and she fell across just as she heard him kicking the chair out of the way and lumbering across the kitchen floor. Still guided by a semblance of reason, she shut the door behind her and twisted the lock to give herself another few seconds of time. As she picked herself up and limped towards the house next door, she heard his grunted frustration upon finding the second door locked. He tried to rattle the door off its frame, and she could hear every pane of glass vibrating. She leaned against the doorbell of the Martinson home, which she knew to be occupied by an aged and not particularly friendly couple. It seemed to take an eternity for them to respond, but a light did go on. She pounded on the door, shrieking, "Please, help me! Call the police, please!" She saw a hand part a shade and an eye peer out at her. "Please call the police!" she shouted at the face. The window lifted an inch.
"No more trick-or-treaters. It's late. Go away. We have no more candy."
"Oh, God!" Laurie groaned as the light went out. At that moment she heard a pane of glass smash and her pursuer's hand thumping on the outside of the side door, looking for the lock. Dragging her bad ankle, she made her way across the street. She looked over her shoulder and saw the side door burst open and the black shape stagger out into the driveway. He looked around and then spotted her. She was almost at the Doyles' front door. The key! Where was the key? She had clutched a ring of keys in her hand when she entered the Wallace home. Her jeans had been too tight to stuff a key ring into her pocket, so she had carried them into the house, and somewhere in the melee she had dropped them. He was coming after her in steady, unhurried steps, knife bared as if daring the world to stop him. Anyone looking out at the scene would see a Halloween mime presented by a couple of clever youngsters. Why those shrieks of hers were so blood-curdling they might be the real thing. And look how cunningly he'd painted the knife blade to look like blood. Laurie pounded the door with the flat palm of her hand. "Tommy! Tommy, open the door! I'm locked out!" She thumped with her closed fist. "Tommy, wake up! It's me, Laurie!" She looked around and found a geranium planter beside the doormat. She picked it up, stepped back, and threw it at the bedroom window where Tommy and Lindsay were sleeping. "Please, God, smash!" "Tommy, wake up! It's me, Laurie!" She stood helplessly waiting for that welcome face to appear in the window. She continued shouting. The shape was halfway across the street now, the features of his face resolving under the streetlight. Either it was a rubber mask or a real face too hideous to imagine. "Tommy!" A sleepy face peered out of the broken glass. "Laurie?" "Tommy, hurry down here and open up the door, please, hurry!" The face disappeared, and Laurie prayed that the kid didn't think he was dreaming and go back to bed. The murderer was on the lawn now and loping towards her, knife poised. Laurie's mind flashed on the sight of Annie with her belly ripped open and her guts hanging out on the bed. "Tommy, hurry!" The blessed sound of a bolt being thrown open. She twisted the doorknob and shoved her way inside, knocking Tommy down. She slammed the door and twisted the lock and drove home a second bolt as Tommy picked himself up and rubbed his eyes. "Tommy, I want you to go back upstairs." "What is it, Laurie?" "Be quiet. Get Lindsay and get back into the bedroom and lock the door." "I'm scared." "Do what I say now." He backed away towards the stairs. "Laurie?" "What?" "It's the boogeyman, isn't it?" "Hurry!" Tommy burst into hysterical sobs as he scampered up the stairs. The bedroom door slammed and clicked as Tommy locked it. She could hear Tommy and Lindsay making each other crazy with fear, but there was no time to spare to calm them down. She dashed for the phone and picked it up, waiting for a dial tone, finger poised over the dial. No dial tone. The phone was dead. She slammed it down and stood paralyzed, trying to determine her next move. A breeze rippled through the air, rustling through her hair. It was coming from the kitchen. She took one step toward the kitchen, then stopped and backed away. If the door was already open, it was too late. He was already in the house. Now it overwhelmed her. The reality of evil, the horror of reality penetrated to a brain that since birth had been programmed to perceive horror and evil as something that could be contained within the perimeter of a 19-inch television tube. The shock was so violent she thought she would go mad. She buried her face and let out a mournful wail, followed by choking sobs. "Please, please stop," she whimpered, sinking to her knees before the living room couch. "Please." She became aware of another sound in the room. Someone was breathing heavy and advancing on her. "Please." Sam Loomis ran up the street, head tilted like a bloodhound trying to pick up a scent. Except this wasn't a smell he was seeking, but a feeling, a vibration.
You're getting hot. No. Getting cold. No. You're getting hot again. Hotter. Ooh, colder.
A voice seemed to say to him. His eyes searched house after house, hoping to detect something out of kilter, but he was greeted with the disappointing sight of prim house after prim house, nestled beneath sheltering trees on pleasantly manicured lawns. If only this were 19th century Transylvania, he said blackly to himself, I'd know where to search. But this is the last quarter of the 20th century, and a lovely suburban town in Midwest in modern America. Surely any manifestation of evil would shine like a beacon.
God damn your soul, show yourself!
He cried at the night sky. A pair of headlights pinned him as a police car swerved onto the street. The car pulled to an abrupt halt next to him.
Where the hell were you?
Brackett shouted from his window. Loomis could see his face flushed with rage.
I went back to the Myers house.
Loomis impatiently waved him quiet.
I found the hospital station wagon. He's here.
Where's the car?
3 blocks down. Look, you go up to the street and back down the next one. I'll go this way and crisscross you. Honk your horn if you see anything. Fire your gun if it's serious. I'll fire mine.
And if I see him?
Fire your gun at his heart.
Chapter 15. With death near at hand, a host of crazy thoughts tumbled through Laurie's brain. It was not exactly as they said, your life passing before your eyes. It was more like random snapshots of herself pulled from an unassorted collection. A trip to Michigan with her father, when their canoe was blown ashore by a violent, sudden squall, a 2-layer cake baked with her mother, and the discovery they'd made only enough icing for 1 layer, a baby raccoon she'd kept for a pet until it tore up the den in a fit of rage. She wondered what it would have been like to go to bed with a man. She wondered who would come to her funeral. She wondered what grades your teachers gave you if you died mid-term. She wondered what they'd dress her in for her funeral, and whether her face would be mutilated when they opened the coffin. She wondered what would have happened if she'd kept her date with Ben Tramer. She wondered what it was like to die, and to be dead. She sat at the foot of the couch, almost serenely, like a condemned person awaiting execution. Beside her lay Mrs. Doyle's knitting kit. The needles. The needles! Her blood-stained hand enclosed one of the long needles at the precise moment his forearm encircled her neck. His arm might have been carved out of mahogany. It was solid and muscular, and for the instant before she acted, it clamped off her windpipe as effectively as a steel vise. She smelled the vile reek of blood on his arm and the stench of his breath. She knew that if she hesitated even 2 seconds, it would all be over, for even if he did not strangle her to death, the blade in his other hand might even now be describing the arc that would terminate her belly. Measuring her next move carefully, knowing it might be her last if she were wrong, she thrust the 8-inch needle over his shoulder in the vicinity of his face. She felt it sink deeply into flesh. She heard a grunt, and his forearm relaxed long enough for her to slide out from under it. She ran for the stairs, looking behind her for just a heartbeat. He was staggering back from the couch, clawing at a needle buried in his neck. She ascended the staircase 3 steps at a time, despite the agonizing pain in her swollen ankle. She pounded on the locked bedroom door. "It's me, Tommy! Lindsay! It's me! Open the door! Hurry!" Tommy opened the door and peeked out. She rushed into the room, knocking the kid on his behind for the 2nd time. She kicked the door shut and locked it. The children's faces were stained with tears and their eyes rolled involuntarily. They were perilously close to passing out from shock. She embraced them, shushing. "It's all right, kids. Shh. It's all..." She cocked her head. She could hear movement downstairs, furniture being shoved around, heavy footsteps staggering towards the stairs. "Now," she said, fighting desperately to contain the fear savaging her chest. "I want you to change your clothes, Tommy. We're going to take a walk outside." "It was the boogeyman, wasn't it?" the boy said, his little body trembling like a trapped animal's. "No," said Laurie, listening. There was a heavy thud at the foot of the stairs, then silence. She brightened. If that noise was what she hoped it was, the threat was over. No, it wasn't. I'm so scared, whimpered Lindsay. There's nothing to be scared of now, she reassured the little girl. Again, she listened. It was quiet. Are you sure? Tommy pleaded. Yes. How do you know? Because I killed him. But you can't kill the boogeyman. I can, and I did. He's lying at the foot of the... Her sentence was shattered, along with her peace of mind, by a tremendous blow on the door. It held, but the panel closest to the knob arched inward, showering the floor with paint chips. The next blow would shatter it. Though the fight had all but drained out of her, Laurie moved instinctively to save the children, hauling them into the bathroom. They bawled like cattle in a slaughterhouse as she closed the door on them, shouting, "Lock it! Lock the door!" She waited 10 lifetimes for the click, and wondered what good it did to lock doors when this beast was able to shatter them like rice paper screens. Already his fist had broken through the weakened panel and was groping for the lock. She would have liked to strike that vulnerable hand with a heavy weapon, but she couldn't leave her post until the kids locked the door. "Tommy!" The bolt clicked on the bathroom door just as the bolt on the bedroom door gave. Laurie backed away, looking around the room for a weapon or some place to hide. But nothing better than a louvered walk-in clothes closet presented itself. She dashed for it, parting the double doors and slamming them closed behind her. She noticed a tie rack just inside the door, and now grabbed a tie and wrapped it around the little porcelain doorknob so as to hold the double doors closed. What good this would do, she didn't know, and she laughed grimly to think that anyone who could punch through half-inch plywood would be fazed by a door of thin pine slats held closed by a necktie. But perhaps it would buy her 3 seconds to think, to prepare, to defend herself. Or maybe it would merely buy her 3 more to live. She heard the bedroom door burst open and his stumping footsteps enter the room. He growled as he breathed, and again the reek of her friend's blood, freshly spilled on his hands, permeated the room. She moved farther back into the closet and sent some empty hangers jingling to the floor. Nice going, Laurie, she said to herself. Why didn't you just shout, "I'm in here, Mr. Murderer"? He shuffled towards the closet and rattled it with tornado-like force. Laurie retreated to a corner of the closet and slumped to the floor. So, this is where you die, she declared inwardly. A second later, the fist came through the louvers with ease of a hammer smashing a balsa toy. The blood-clotted hand swept the closet, fingers seeking a piece, any piece of Laurie's body, but finding only clothes and hangers. These fell on her, and with them fell on her exhausted mind the last thing to do before succumbing to the assassin's crazed assault. She picked up a wire hanger. She began to untwist the handle, which consisted of 2 ends of the heavy gauge wire wrapped around themselves. As the killer's hands played up and down the louvre's slats, she at last managed to separate the 2 ends of the wire and unbend the hanger. She grasped it tightly halfway up and held it ready. The door hung on a splinter. The next strike would destroy it. Sure, it bellied and buckled and exploded in a million fragments, and Laurie seemed to see them all in sharply focused slow motion, like the fragments of a life blasted beyond recognition. A father, a mother, a home, a school, a friend, a past, a future, a present. The snarling thing was inside the closet with her, lashing out at a limp clothing and sweeping it aside or tossing it to the floor. The ferocity of it was so wonderful to see, and some detached, dispassionate part of her watched the performance with admiration, as if it were a circus ring and she was safely outside. Then she was no longer a spectator. She was now the prize at the bottom of the bin. Though dark as a coal mine, she could see that he had turned away from the far corner of the closet and now faced her, his eyes as keenly focused in the darkness as hers were. They confronted one another silently except for the hiss of their breath. There followed a moment when Laurie fantasized that he would not make his lunge, that he would tear off his mask and laugh and say it was all a Halloween prank, and the bodies across the street were just cleverly made-up store dummies, and you could get up now and go home, and we'll see you next Halloween.
Or maybe he had decided he'd had enough slaughter for one night and would turn away and deliver himself into the hands of the police. Or maybe he'd succumb at this very last instant to the wound in the neck she'd inflicted in his neck with Mrs. Doyle's needle. Sure, Laurie, sure. Still dreaming right up to the last, aren't you? Slowly, deliberately, he drew the knife out of his belt and knelt before her, gauging the precise spot where he would plunge the blade in. She wondered what part of her he would consider prime. He seemed to be studying her the way a butcher studies the carcass of a steer. She clutched the wire hanger with both hands and concentrated on the one vulnerable area she thought she could damage. She felt his hot, stinking breath on her face and knew he would never be closer while she lived. With a prayer to God, she thrust the hanger into the black hole in the mask, where a glint of an eyeball reflected what scant light there was in the room. For a second there was resistance, as if the wire had struck his cheekbone or nose or eyebrow. Then the point punched through with a squish, and he recoiled with a primitive howl that would stay in her mind forever as the most chilling sound she'd ever heard. Reflexively, he swung at her with the knife, but she'd already slid out from under and was rolling out of the closet and staggering to her feet. The assailant lurched out after her, both hands covering his face. His knife had dropped to his feet, and she saw it and wondered if she could snatch it before he did. Her jab with the wire hanger had penetrated one eye, but he had one good one left, and she knew that as long as his heart beat at all, he would come on, his determination as fixed as if his entire system had been programmed with but one function: to kill. She circled out of the range of his good eye, but he stood almost atop the knife, and she had to get him off of it. What she did next was either incredible or incredibly stupid, and maybe it was a little bit of both. Picking up one of Mrs. Doyle's perfume atomizers, she threw it at him, shouting, "Over here! Over here, buddy!" He pivoted in the direction of her voice, and as he did, she pivoted with him so as to keep to his blind side. He staggered towards the spot she'd been in, giving her the opportunity to lunge for the knife. She grabbed the handle with both hands. Suddenly, all the agitation drained from her, and a calm and clarity settled upon her. "Over here, pal. Here I am. Come and get me," she beckoned almost seductively. If anyone had told her a mere 3 or 4 hours ago that she would be shoving a knife into a man's body, she'd have had that person certified and committed to the funny farm. But now that she realized that this nightmare wasn't going to end by itself, that no one was going to shake her shoulder and say, "Come on, wake up, it's time to go to school," she felt capable of anything. She had, in the course of a half hour, gone from a wide-eyed innocent to a willing, even eager participant in this deadly game. No soldier had ever gone through a quicker basic training. With one hand over his blind and bloodied eye, and the other swiping the air for a piece of his tormentress, he stumped towards her, bellowing in rage and pain. She crouched so that he loomed over her, filling the space above with his black presence. "Now, Laurie? No, not yet. One more second. Let him get close enough to stumble over you. Now, Laurie? Now, please? Hurry before it's too late. Yes, now. Do it now, Laurie." Just as his knees were about to collide with her, she plunged the blade upwards with both hands into his groin. The knife went in so easily she wasn't sure if she'd actually stabbed anything. Only his bellow of pure pain confirmed the strike. She wanted to twist and slash the blade inside his guts the way he'd done to Annie, but he dropped away from her, groaning to a corner of the room, and she didn't want to risk administering a coup de grace in the dark. The kids, meanwhile, were crying hysterically in the bathroom, and she had to get them out. She heard of people actually being frightened to death, and now she knew it was entirely possible. As it was, the kids would bear the mark of this traumatic night in their souls forevermore. "And you, Laurie," said herself as she rushed to the bathroom door, "won't do so badly in that department yourself." It took her several minutes of pleading and reassuring to get them to open the door. She kept looking over her shoulder and listening. There was a stirring in the corner,
but presently it ceased. He's got to be dead, she told herself, but her mind played back the memory of the big pickerel her daddy had caught on a trip he'd taken her on to the Wisconsin woods. Having forgotten to bring his creel, he wrapped the fish in newspaper and placed it in an old shopping bag. On the way home, a half an hour later, the fish, which had thought long dead, began a violent death thrash that had startled both of them so much her father had nearly driven into a tree. At last, she coaxed the children out of the bathroom. They fell blubbering into Laurie's arms. Their eyes were swollen from crying, and they trembled like puppies. "Listen to me. Listen, children," she begged them. "Catch your breath. Breathe deep. Don't think about it any more. It's all over." "You said that before." "No, this time it really is all over. Now, I want you to walk to the door, down the stairs, and right out the front door." "You're coming with us?" Lindsay said, a question and a command. "Listen to me. I want you to walk down the street to the Mackenzies and knock on their door. You tell them to call the police and send them over here. Do you understand?" "Laurie, you come with us," Tommy pleaded. "No, do as I say." She guided them across the bedroom to the head of the stairs and sent them off with a smack and the fanny each. They scampered downstairs and fled screaming into the night as Laurie collapsed on the top step to catch her breath and summon her wits for one last visit to the bedroom to make sure the monster was dead. She would never be able to sleep again if she did not witness for herself that it would never more rise a hand against mankind. She buried her face in her hands and fought to regain control of herself. Thus situated, she did not see the shadowy shape dragging itself out of the bedroom. The shrieking came from the next block, and Loomis knew this was no Halloween prank. It was too late for children to be outside, and if that was not true terror in their cries for help, Loomis did not know what true terror was. He cut across the lawn to find them racing up a walk to a white ranch house. They saw him, a Mephistophelian figure in a goatee, bald head, and trench coat, fluttering in the wind, and they shrieked even louder, turning tail and fleeing into a backyard. "It's him! It's the boogeyman!" he heard one shout. He hurled a rustic fence and dashed into the yard. "Children, it's all right," he murmured in his most reassuring tone. "It's all right, kids. I'm your friend." They were not difficult to find. He spotted their light clothing behind a tree too narrow to conceal them, and though he knew it would scare the wits out of them if their wits hadn't been totally scared out of them already, he had to capture them to find out what they were running away from. He tiptoed up to the tree, then dashed around it, tackling both in strong but gentle arms. They broke into hysterical cries and wriggled in his arms in a desperate effort to escape. He clutched them tightly, uttering tender blandishments to soothe them until at last they relaxed long enough to answer his questions. "Where are you coming from?" "There," the little boy said with a general sweep of the western horizon. "Where's there? Show me." They escorted him back to the front lawn. Tommy pointed to a house catty-corner from their position. Its lights were out, its front door wide open. "What's going on out there?" a voice shouted. A porch light went on, and a man in pajamas stormed out of the house. "There's trouble across the street, serious trouble," Loomis said, dragging the children to the man by the collars of their shirts. "Take these kids and call the police at once. Get Sheriff Brackett. Tell him I found our friend at that house there." "The Doyle house?"
"Whichever that one is with the open door."
"Mister, this is a joke. I mean, I've been trick-or-treated to death tonight."
"You don't know what death is," Loomis hissed, drawing his gun as he rushed across the street. Laurie inhaled deeply, realizing it was the first calm breath she'd taken since it all began. She lifted her face from her hands and contemplated the next move. She wasn't sure what it should be. She would have liked to wait for the police, but God knew if the kids had done what she had instructed them to do. So she didn't want to wait, but she didn't want to flee the house either. Suppose she did, and when she returned with the police, he was gone. Would she ever sleep peacefully again, knowing he was out there, alive, lurking, stalking? No, She must either stand guard here outside the bedroom door or go in there and look upon the still corpse so that she could comfort herself with the image of his dead body whenever the horror visited her dreams. That is, if he were dead. Suppose he weren't. She knew he was badly hurt. A needle in the neck, a hanger in the eye, a knife in the groin. Surely no one who wasn't supernatural could endure such injuries and still live. Then what held her back from going in there? It was the realization that if by some miracle he were still alive, she would have to finish the job. She was no longer afraid that he could harm her. It was inconceivable to her that he could be that alive, let alone alive at all. No, it was the idea of actually murdering someone in cold blood. Self-defense was one thing, but a helpless man, even one who had slaughtered her 3 friends, who had attempted to do the same to her, well, she wasn't sure she could bring herself to do it. Essentially, she was not an avenger. Civilization was too deeply bred into her. The killer instinct had been diluted to the point where normally she could not imagine doing anything more harmful with a knife than cutting a slab of roast beef on her dinner plate. The longer she sat, the more confused and uncertain she became. She wished the decision could be taken out of her hands. A moment later it was. In a night filled with startling horrors, this was the most startling and horrible of all. The hand on her hair pulling at her scalp until she was sure he would tear it off her head like an orange peel. His other hand enclosed her throat, and only because she'd had her arms in front of her face did she prevent him from snapping her neck on the first blow. As it was, she heard a bone snap in her wrist, and she knew it was all over this time. She'd been lucky 3 times, but she'd underestimated her foe. Now she was his. She kicked to her feet and squirmed in his grasp, hoping to kick them both down the stairs where he just might release her. But he guessed her strategy and yanked her away from the landing. His forearm tightened around the wrists pinned to her face, and the pain was so excruciating she knew she would pass out in another second. Then she heard the explosion and felt his body jump as if someone had struck him with a fist. She was free. She fell to the floor, and her hand was a damp rubber mask. She looked for her assailant and found him leaning against a wall, a dark blotch spreading quickly over his right shoulder. Through the darkness and the flashing lights dancing in her eyes, she looked at his face and saw it, white with wider fang-like teeth. His wet black hair was matted over his forehead, and one eye bulged like a dead fish's. Where his other eye had been was a wet, bloody hole. A movement on the stairs caught her attention. A bald man with a goatee was running up them, holding a huge black revolver with trembling hands. "Get out of the way!" he shouted at her. She rolled away as he mounted the stairs. The dying man staggered into the bedroom towards the French windows that opened onto the Doyle sun deck. The bald man reached the landing and stepped into the bedroom, leveling his gun at the retreating figure. The explosions were ear-splitting. Laurie was deafened by the first, and felt rather than heard the subsequent ones. She saw the assailant lurch back with each gunshot as if struck with a bat. He crashed backwards through the French windows and tumbled from the sun deck into the backyard below. The moon and street light caught the blood gloss of it at least 3 bullet holes in his chest. She did not ask at first who her rescuer was. She simply fell into his arms and burst into racking sobs. His embrace was so comforting she could have fallen asleep in it. Maybe if she did, she would wake up to find the world as it had been this morning. This morning? Was it a mere 16 or 17 hours since she had stood on her doorstep bantering with her father? It seemed as if she'd lived 3 lifetimes in that scant time. Suddenly she was in pain. The adrenaline that seemed to act as an anesthetic started to wear off. Her ankle throbbed where she twisted it, dropping over the stairs at Lindsay's house. Her wrist ached and had begun to swell where she'd cracked the bone. Her slashed arm tingled agonizingly. Her scalp felt as if someone had taken a tomahawk to it. No, these were not the symptoms of a dream. This was the nightmare of reality.
It would take her years to absorb this truth and a lifetime to ponder it. The man released her, and she looked up at him.
Thank you. Are you a policeman?
He smiled. No, just a friend. A friend with a gun, thank God. Thank God. Loomis was trembling. He hyperventilated several times to slow down his racing heart. Then he walked to the shattered windows and peered down. It lay on its back amid 1,000 shards of broken glass that twinkled in the moonlight like a hoarfrost. The front of the uniform stolen from the truck driver glistened blackly with blood that seeped out of the tremendous rents in his flesh caused by Loomis's magnum. One of its eyes gazed stupidly up to the sky. Where the other had been was a black hole, caked with clotted blood and jellied aqueous humor. Loomis stared at the corpse a long time, watching for a sign of life. Detecting none, he turned back into the bedroom and reached into his trench coat pocket.
What are you doing?
The girl asked. Reloading, he said, pushing the long, heavy cartridges into the chamber of his gun.
Why?
Loomis shrugged. It heightens my sense of security, he said with an irony that was lost on her. He started down the steps.
Where are you going?
To examine the body. I would like you to go across the street and wait for the police.
No, said Laurie. I think I'd like to come with you.
Loomis looked at her quizzically. You haven't had enough for one night.
I want to make sure it's all over.
Suit yourself. I assure you it is. Which is why you're reloading your gun, Loomis said to himself, heading downstairs. From the way the girl clutched his arm, he knew she was thinking the same thing. Poor child. If she knew what he knew, she'd be thinking darker thoughts than that even. She'd be thinking about the dream that little Michael, angelic choir boy face turned to the ceiling as if in prayer, had told him some 15 years ago. A dream about his vengeance on a druid girl who had not returned his love, and on her lover who had mocked him. A dream about a ceremony on an accursed gravesite, where his head and heart were left exposed to the elements to rot, while some shaman recited an awful curse, dooming him to roam the earth forever lusting for blood. She'd be thinking about Michael's great-grandfather, who had been tortured by that identical dream, a dream that had inflamed both of them to commit deeds of wanton horror. She'd be thinking about the voices that spoke both to Michael and to his great-grandfather, urging them to take revenge against someone who had lived over 1,000 years ago. She'd be thinking about a festival called Samhain, whose grotesque rituals designed to protect druid harvests against the depredations of howling demons had been transformed over a millennium or more into the harmless holiday called Halloween. Halloween, charming children in cute costumes, begging sweets, cardboard cutouts of skeletons and witches on brooms, warmly glowing jack-o'-lanterns, artless parties and entertaining games, spooky movies on TV, innocent pranks, trick-or-treat. Loomis exited into the cool night air and rounded the side of the house, trailed by Laurie. Cautiously, he prowled towards the backyard, the moonlight glinting on the blue barrel of his gun. One more corner to turn. Loomis stuck his head around slowly and focused his eyes on the place where the body had landed beneath the French windows. It was gone. He rushed to the spot, suppressing a sob of frustration. A patch of flattened grass surrounded by twinkling shards of glass. No other sign, not even blood. Above the thudding of his heart, he heard the girl whimper from behind him. He turned and put his hand under her arm to support her. Mutely, they stared at the patch of grass. Until this moment, he had hoped against hope that the entity he had pursued to this place was a thing of flesh and blood like himself, though deep in his heart he had known it would be otherwise. The evidence pointed not merely to another interpretation, but, as he had said to Sheriff Brackett, to another dimension. He shuddered, wondering what little boy at this very moment was tossing in his sleep, tortured by a dream of tragic love that had occurred far away and long ago, tormented by a voice commanding the dreamer to take revenge. Laurie's nails dug into his shoulder as she stared like a soldier in shell shock at the empty place on the lawn.
It was the boogeyman, wasn't it?
She murmured. As a matter of fact, Loomis replied, it was. Okay, guys, that is the end of the novelization of the 1978 movie Halloween. Thank you so much for joining in with us on this reading. I do hope your Halloween plans are going well, and if you're hearing this after the Halloween season, I hope you're doing well. In the meantime, don't forget to keep reading, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and as always, be kind to one another.